The moment you realize the loudest voice in your life was never your own, everything changes. That truth didn't arrive gently for me. It came in a single piercing moment, standing in my father's kitchen, his voice crashing over mine for the 1,000th time, echoing off the walls the way it had my entire childhood. There was no dramatic fight, no broken plates, no slammed doors. Just a silence inside me so deep that I finally heard something I'd been ignoring for years. The quiet plea of a person who had been shrinking to fit someone else's anger. I grew up believing volume meant certainty, that the one who spoke the loudest must also be the one who was right. And when you're a child, you learn to adapt to that kind of weather, standing still when the storm comes, hoping it passes without taking too much of you with it. But storms don't always pass. Sometimes they settle into the walls of a home, into the rhythm of ordinary days, until the noise becomes so familiar you forget it's hurting you. My story begins the day I decided to step outside of that storm and finally listen, not to him, but to myself. It begins with a laptop, a handful of recordings, and the terrifying realization that proof doesn't always heal, but it does reveal. It begins with the first boundary I ever set, the first time I said no, the first moment I stood in my own silence without apologizing for it. If you've ever felt unheard, unseen, or pushed aside by someone who loved you loudly but not gently, then this story may feel painfully familiar. Stay with me. This one matters. If you want more stories like this, raw, human, and honest, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. I showed up at my father's house with a small lemon tart in a paper box. My attempt at softening the edges of a weekend that already felt tense. He opened the door with that half-surprised, half-impatient expression he always wore, as if he hadn't actually expected me to follow through. The kitchen smelled like reheated stew. The TV in the living room murmured in the background. I placed the tart on the counter, trying to add something warm to a room that hadn't felt warm in years. He barely glanced at it before launching into a story about a coworker who didn't know a thing about real labor. His voice filled the house faster than the smell of food. I pulled out a chair, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "It looks good," I said. But he didn't hear me. Or maybe he did and chose not to. He sat across from me, leaning forward, elbows wide, telling his story with an unnecessary force that made the water in our glasses tremble. His voice always had presence. Tonight it had dominance. With every rise of his tone, something inside me curled inward, like a leaf trying to make itself small against the wind. I nodded at the right moments, or at least the moments he wanted me to. When he laughed sharply, I let out a faint one of my own. The distance between us wasn't measured in feet, but in decibels. I tried to place the tart in the middle of the table like a neutral offering, but even it seemed too delicate for this space. When he paused long enough for me to breathe, I tried to talk about my week at the library, about a reference request that made me laugh, about the quiet satisfaction of helping a high schooler find an old poetry book. "I had kind of a good week," I began, but he cut in immediately, as if my words were just background noise interrupting his main broadcast. "Can you speak up?" he barked, not unkindly in his mind, but sharply enough to slice the moment. "I can't hear a thing you're saying." I lifted my voice a little, though it felt unnatural, like trying on a coat that didn't belong to me. He nodded once, already shifting back into his own narrative. Somewhere between his complaints about management and a long monologue about how people didn't know real responsibility anymore, I realized my shoulders had crept upward, tightened, as if bracing for impact. I'd been doing that since childhood, shrinking, adjusting, bending myself around the volume of him. "It's fine," I whispered to myself, pressing my hands together under the table. "I'm used to it." But the words, even in my own head, sounded tired. I watched his mouth move, Watched the way he didn't notice the ripple his voice sent through every object in the room, through me. I stirred my water with a spoon to give my hands something to do, pretending calm I did not feel. Above us, the ceiling fan hummed, a steady rhythmic slice of air. I glanced up at it almost instinctively. That sound had been the soundtrack of my childhood dinners, the thrum of the fan, the clatter of utensils, and my father's voice overshadowing everything else. Tonight the fan felt louder than usual, as if it was reminding me of something I had tried not to remember. Its blades cut the air in a slow, hypnotic pattern, and for a moment, it felt like the fan itself was trying to speak on my behalf, whispering a truth I wasn't ready to say out loud. When he leaned back and raised his voice again, this time dismissing a coworker, then the news, then the world at large, the glass plate under my fork began to tremble. The vibration moved through the table, a thin shiver that traveled straight into my chest. I stared at it, the way the edge of the plate tapped ever so slightly against the wood, as if responding to him, as if echoing something I'd ignored for far too long. That was the moment I knew something in me had shifted, quietly, but unmistakably. On the walk back to my apartment, the evening air felt cooler than I expected, brushing against my arms as if trying to wake something in me. Maybe it worked because memories I usually kept folded away started to loosen. I saw flashes of my father in the garage, his voice booming over the sound of metal tools, telling me I was doing it wrong before I even tried. I remembered standing on a small stool, holding a bent nail, fighting tears because crying always made things worse. "That's the wrong direction, Lily. Are you listening?" Those moments came back, not as sharp stabs, but as a low ache, something long settled now shifting again. I stood at the crosswalk, hands buried in my jacket, wondering when exactly his voice became a weather pattern in my life, something I adapted to without noticing. By the time I reached my building, the tiredness had settled somewhere behind my ribs, not the kind you fix with sleep, but the kind you get from carrying something too heavy for too long. I unlocked my door and stepped into the quiet, letting it wrap around me like a soft blanket. I put my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and leaned against the counter, breathing slowly. I'd always told myself I was strong enough to handle him, that his volume was just a trait, like someone's bad handwriting or stubborn temper. But tonight, I felt something different, a tugging weight, like gravity shifting inside my chest. I poured myself a glass of water and tried to name it. Exhaustion? Maybe. Or maybe something closer to recognition. I sat at the small table by the window, idly smoothing the corner of a napkin with my thumb. When I finally looked at my phone, I hesitated before texting him. Instead, I let myself think about the interview I had coming up, a rare opportunity, something I actually wanted. "It's for the youth program," I murmured to no one, rolling the napkin into a soft rope. A position that worked with teenagers, guiding them through reading lists, helping them write essays. It felt meaningful. I pictured telling him, imagine the small moment of pride he might show. And for a second, I almost convinced myself to believe in that version of him. I practiced a few lines aloud, trying to sound steady, rehearsing hope like a fragile script. But when I had shared it earlier that night, he hadn't even paused long enough to consider the idea. "That job isn't for you," he'd said, waving a hand as if swatting away a fruit fly. "You need something stable, something serious." The dismissal landed in my chest with a thud, ripping through the brief flicker of excitement I'd let myself feel. I remembered the coolness in his voice, the easy certainty with which he declared what my life should look like, what I could or couldn't handle. Sitting alone now, the sting of that moment resurfaced, gritty and cold. I pressed my fingers to my forehead, letting out a breath through my teeth. It wasn't the first time he'd cut off a dream before it had air. But tonight, it felt different. It felt heavier. I pulled my knees up and wrapped my arms around them, watching the window reflect the dim apartment light. A faint smile tugged at my mouth, one of those thin, practiced ones meant to hide things even from myself. I knew the gesture well. It had become a reflex over the years. When things got uncomfortable, when his voice pinned me to a wall I couldn't see, I'd stretch my mouth into that same polite curve. Tonight it felt smaller, tighter. I looked down at my hands, steady but tired, and reached for my phone again, scrolling aimlessly just to feel occupied. The apartment was so quiet that the small click of my nails on the screen felt like a sound worth holding on to. When the overhead light flickered slightly, I glanced up, half expecting something dramatic to follow. But it was just the building doing what old buildings do. Still, it made my chest tighten, like a breath held too long. I turned off the light and let the room sink into a softer glow. In the dimness, I could almost pretend the night had gone differently, that my father had listened, even briefly. But the truth hung in the room with me, steady and undeniable. Something old had been nudged awake, and I wasn't sure it would settle back down. The next afternoon, I sat in my car in the fast food parking lot, the smell of fries drifting through the cracked window. I'd treated myself to lunch, something small, something warm, to steady my nerves before checking my email. When I finally opened my inbox, the message was there. The interview invitation. A tiny bubble of joy rose in me, surprising in its softness. I smiled, really smiled, biting into a hot fry like it was some ceremonial celebration. Cars idled around me, kids shouted in the backseat of a minivan nearby, and for a moment, the world felt normal, even kind. I reread the email twice, letting the possibility settle in my bones. It felt like a door cracking open somewhere inside me, letting in air I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath against. Later that evening, while I washed dishes at my father's house, I heard the faint shuffle of him behind me. I didn't turn at first. I was too focused on rinsing soap from a plate. Then I realized the clinking wasn't dishes. It was my phone. He'd picked it up from the counter. "Just checking the time," he said loudly, almost defensively, as if I'd already accused him. My hands froze under the warm stream of water. I kept my voice calm. "I could have told you the time, Dad." But he waved off my words, placing the phone back down a little too lightly, like he wanted to make his innocence visible. Something inside me tightened, a quiet knot forming beneath my ribs. When I dried my hands and finally checked my phone, the breath left my lungs for half a second. The interview email, my email, was marked as read. The timestamp sat there like a fingerprint. I blinked at the screen, hoping it was a glitch, that maybe my thumb had brushed something accidentally. But I knew better. A cool sensation slid down my spine. Not fear exactly, but a strange mix of violation and disbelief. It was just a message, sure, just an email. But it wasn't his to open. It wasn't his moment to take. I locked the screen quietly, pressing the button with slow, deliberate pressure, as if trying to steady myself through the gesture alone. He walked past me then, talking louder than before, launching into a lecture about responsibility and adulthood, his voice echoing off the narrow hallway. Words like "grow up" and "take things seriously" bounced around me, sharp-edged and heavy. I tried to follow what he was saying, but my thoughts kept circling back to that single opened message. I felt myself pulling inward again, each raised syllable pushing me a little further from my own center. My breathing shortened, thin and shallow. I wondered if he even noticed the shift in me, the way his volume filled the space like smoke. Probably not. He rarely noticed the weather inside me. I stood still, hands clasped together in front of me, trying to piece the moment apart in my mind. The phone, the email, his voice. It all blended into one realization. Something had been crossed. A boundary I hadn't even fully defined until that second. The strange part was how quickly I questioned myself. Maybe he didn't mean it, I thought. Maybe it was nothing. I'd grown so used to shrinking my discomfort that even now, when the line was clearly crossed, my first instinct was to fold myself smaller. I swallowed and looked at the floor, grounding myself against the cool tile. The kitchen was dim when I finally stepped away, my phone lighting up softly in my hand as I moved toward the doorway. I left the room without saying much, listening to the faint hum of the appliances, the quiet sting of the moment still clinging to me. As I passed to the living room, the glow of the phone screen reflected briefly on the wall, bright against the shadows. I paused, staring at it, feeling the weight of what I now knew with unsettling clarity. Something had shifted again, and this time the shift felt like a warning. I waited until morning, hoping that a night's sleep might settle the uneasy churn in my chest. It didn't. So I chose my moment carefully, catching my father just as he sat down at the dining table with his coffee. I kept my voice steady, quieter than normal, partly to protect myself, partly to avoid triggering him. "Dad, did you check my phone yesterday?" I asked. He blinked, surprised not by the question but by the audacity of me asking it. I held his gaze, even as something inside me braced. I wasn't accusing, I was trying to understand. But the room suddenly felt too small, too heavy with something that had been waiting for years to show its teeth. He slammed his mug down hard enough that a drop of coffee jumped onto the table. "What? You think I go snooping around your stuff?" The sharpness in his tone struck like a physical blow. The walls seemed to throw his voice back at us, building it into something larger than either of us could contain. It wasn't the first time he'd responded this way, voice first, reason later, but today it felt different. Maybe because I wasn't backing down immediately. Maybe because he sensed it. His glare hardened, as if offense alone could erase the truth I'd already seen. I kept breathing, slow and intentional, the only thing I could control in that moment. He shook his head and pushed his chair back, rising with a dramatic exhale. "You're too sensitive," he said, almost laughing. "You always make a big deal out of nothing." The words hit harder than the volume, slipping into me the way cold water spills down a collar. I didn't respond right away. I didn't trust my voice not to shake. He paced near the counter, still talking, throwing half-formed accusations into the air like they were facts waiting to land. I stood there, hands lightly gripping the edge of the table, letting his dismissal wash over me in a way that felt both familiar and newly unbearable. Eventually, the pressure in the room became too much to stand under. My chest tightened, my fingers numb from gripping the wood. I stepped back, grounding myself with a slow breath. "I'm not trying to fight," I said quietly. "I just want to be heard." The absurdity of the sentence struck me even as I spoke it, trying to be heard by the person who drowned out every sound in his wake. His expression barely shifted. The disbelief, the irritation, the entitlement all sat there unmistakable. I felt a small tremor in my hands, but I kept them at my sides. I wouldn't let him see me fold. Not this time. The silence that followed wasn't calm. It was charged, buzzing with something brittle. Behind him, the overhead fan gave a small metallic click. My father didn't notice, but I did, an instinctive flinch pulling at my shoulders. I steadied myself, inhaling through my nose, letting the breath anchor me. I'd spent so long telling myself his voice wasn't a storm, wasn't dangerous, wasn't harm. But standing there in that thick, humming quiet, I felt the truth settle in. Loudness wasn't just volume, it was dominance, and my body had learned to react before my mind could reason. I swallowed hard, trying to keep the room from spinning out of focus. Then he snapped, "Don't walk away from me," just as I took a single step back. The sound hit the thin screen door behind me, making it vibrate faintly, the frame rattling in protest. I froze, not out of fear, but out of clarity, sharp and sudden. The door trembled again, echoing something I'd been trying to ignore. I straightened slowly, meeting his eyes. His chest heaved with indignation, convinced he had been wronged. But something in me had shifted, quietly, unmistakably. I turned without another word and walked down the hall, leaving his voice hanging in the air behind me like dust refusing to settle. The next morning, the house felt unusually still, like even the walls were holding their breath. I found my father in the kitchen, rinsing a plate under the tap, his back tense but controlled. I approached slowly, not wanting to ignite anything, but also unwilling to pretend nothing had happened. "Dad," I said softly, "can we sit and talk for a minute?" He didn't answer right away, just shut off the water, placed the plate down a little too neatly, and finally turned. His expression was a tight mask of annoyance mixed with something unreadable. I pulled out a chair at the table and sat first, signaling I wasn't here to fight. My fingers interlaced on the wood, steady but cool. When he finally sat, I could feel the weight of every unsaid thing pressing between us. I started slowly, choosing each word like a stone I didn't want to drop too loudly. "Yesterday, it was a lot," I said. "I'm trying to tell you something, and I feel like I keep getting drowned out." His jaw tightened almost instantly. He opened his mouth, already louder than necessary, the defense rising before the thought. "You always exaggerate," he said, the sharpness in his tone slicing through the space between us. I placed my hand flat on the table, grounding myself. "I'm not exaggerating," I replied, still calm. "I'm asking you to lower your voice." But my request landed like an insult. He scoffed, loud, dismissive, and leaned back as if I'd said something ridiculous. The air thickened around us, heat rising off his frustration. When he paused long enough for a breath, I forced myself to speak again, even though the words scraped on the way out. "I can't handle being yelled at anymore," I said, the truth bare and simple. It felt strange hearing it out loud, strange and bold. For a moment something flickered in his eyes, but it vanished before it formed into anything meaningful. He barked out a laugh, short, sharp, disbelieving. The sound hit me harder than any accusation. He brushed my words aside with a wave of his hand, like swatting away a child's complaint. My heart folded in on itself, shrinking at the edges. I gripped the strap of my bag on the chair beside me, needing the touch of something solid. His laughter still hung in the air, tilting the room, making everything inside me feel slightly off-center. I felt the sting crawl up my throat, hot and humiliating. I stood abruptly, unable to sit in that moment any longer. "I'm trying," I said, voice trembling despite my effort to keep it steady. He raised an eyebrow, as if amused by the display. That expression, so casually dismissive, hit something deep in me. I swung my bag onto my shoulder, the movement sharper than intended. My pulse thudded at the base of my neck. I didn't trust myself to say anything else without breaking open in front of him, and I wasn't giving him that, not anymore. My father sighed dramatically, as if I were the unreasonable one, as if my discomfort were some burden he had to carry. I felt myself shrinking again, instinctively. But then, something in my chest tugged forward instead of back, a tiny surge of clarity, a thin spark. I straightened. "I need space," I said quietly, trying not to let my voice wobble. I wasn't shouting, wasn't even raising my tone, yet it felt like the loudest thing I'd said in years. I could feel my heartbeat hammering at the inside of my ribs, pushing me toward the doorway. Behind me, he muttered something under his breath, but I didn't stop to decipher it. As I reached for my bag on the table, the spoon beside it vibrated from where he dropped his voice into another harsh exhale. The tiny metallic tremor rippled through the surface, catching the morning light. I stared at it for a beat, its trembling so small, so easy to overlook. But I felt it. I felt all of it. I picked up my bag and stepped away from the table, the decision forming in my bones before it reached my mind. I wasn't going to keep sitting in rooms where every sound belonged to him. When I got back to my apartment, the air felt cooler than usual, brushing against my skin like a reminder that the world outside him still existed. I set my bag down and stood in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do with the weight twisting in my chest. Finally, I propped my phone against a stack of books and hit record on the front camera. "Okay," I whispered to myself, sitting cross-legged on the rug. "Just talk." And I did, halting at first, then spilling more freely, letting the raw confusion slip out in tilted sentences. "Maybe I'm too sensitive," I said. "Or maybe he really doesn't hear how he sounds." Saying it aloud felt like peeling back a layer I had papered over for years. Even alone, my voice shook. When I stopped recording and hit play, I expected to cringe at seeing myself on screen, but instead, the first thing that hit me wasn't my expression. It was the sound of my ceiling fan behind me, a steady hum, louder than I'd ever noticed, swallowing the softer edges of my words. My voice wavered beneath it, thin and easily overtaken. It startled me how familiar that dynamic felt, how instinctively I recognized the imbalance. I shuffled closer to the phone, listening again, jaw tightening as I realized how small I sounded. Not because of weakness, but because of habit. I'd been quiet for so long, I didn't know what my natural volume was supposed to be anymore. I stood and reached up, placing my fingers on the cool metal of the fan's housing. The chill seeped into my fingertips, grounding and strangely symbolic. Maybe it was silly to read into it, but I couldn't shake the thought. Even here, in my own safe space, something was drowning me out. The apartment was supposed to be mine, my quiet, my breath, my refuge. Yet the buzzing above me felt like a reminder of how easily I disappeared under someone else's noise. I turned the fan off, watching the blades slow into stillness. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing into the silence that followed, letting it settle around me like a blanket I didn't realize I'd been missing. I sank onto the couch and replayed the video again, this time listening for my words, not the stutters or the pauses, but the message beneath them. I heard fear, yes, but I also heard something sharper. Exhaustion, bruised patience, a quiet plea for room to exist. My throat tightened. I wrapped my arms around myself, elbows tucked close, and whispered, "I don't want to live like this." Saying it out loud felt like stepping over some invisible line, one I'd never dared approach before. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, not from sadness but from the strange relief of naming something that had lived nameless inside me. Somewhere above me, the fan gave a tiny shift as the metal cooled. The sound was faint, barely noticeable, but enough to pull my attention upward. I exhaled slowly. The apartment finally felt like mine again, like a place where my voice didn't have to fight for space. I reached for my journal, flipping to a blank page, and wrote a single sentence. "I'm tired of being talked over." It looked stark on the paper, honest in a way that made my pulse quicken. I closed the journal gently, letting the truth settle instead of trying to shove it away like I usually did. My phone buzzed on the cushion beside me. A new message from my father lit the screen. "You need to take things more seriously." No greeting, no question, just the same familiar pressure wrapped in typed letters. I stared at it for a long moment, the words flattening something in my chest. But unlike before, there was a thin barrier now, small but present, made of everything I'd just said to myself. I locked the screen and set the phone face down, letting the silence swallow the weight of his message. For the first time in a long while, I didn't respond. The next day, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of mint tea warming my hands. The idea had been circling in my mind since last night, quiet at first, then louder, clearer. I opened my phone, hesitated for a breath, and then hit the record button before calling my father. My finger trembled slightly, but I didn't stop. When he answered, his voice shot through the speaker immediately, sharp and commanding. I've been waiting for you to call me back. Do you hear me? The waveform on the screen spiked red. My heart jolted, but I forced myself not to hang up. I let him finish his sentence before responding, keeping my tone level. I hear you. I'm here. Even saying those words felt like stepping into cold water. Bracing. Necessary. As he continued talking, his volume rose without him noticing. It always rose. The recording app captured every crest and break in his tone, the spikes almost rhythmic. I felt a strange distance open between us. Not emotional numbness, but clarity. Hearing him through a speaker made something impossible to deny. He wasn't just loud. He was overpowering. He filled every corner of the call the way he filled every room. I pressed the phone tighter against my palm, grounding myself against the instinct to shrink. When the call ended, I sat there for a moment, letting the hum of the refrigerator steady me before I dared to listen back. When I hit play, the sound of his voice felt almost unreal, twice as large, twice as forceful, echoing inside my small kitchen. There was no room for me in that recording. His tone eclipsed mine so completely that I had to lean in to hear my own words. My shoulders sagged. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being dramatic. I paused the playback halfway through, feeling a heaviness settle along my collarbone. I'd lived so long inside that volume that I'd forgotten how unnatural it really was. Listening to it as an outsider felt like meeting the truth for the first time. And the truth was undeniable. I created a new folder in my phone, labeled For Conversation, a neutral name, but one that steadied me as I typed it out. I slid the recording into it with a simple drag, the motion both small and monumental. I wasn't planning revenge, wasn't trying to trap him. I just needed something real, something that didn't twist itself in my memory later. When the file landed in the folder, I exhaled slowly. Then guilt crept in, familiar and swift. Was I betraying him? Was I crossing some unspoken line? The questions rose like old ghosts, but I pushed them aside long enough to breathe. My fingers hovered over the messaging app before I finally typed a long paragraph to Marcy. I didn't send the recording, just told her what I had done. Her reply came almost immediately. You're not wrong. You're protecting yourself. I stared at her words, feeling something inside me shift, subtle but firm, like a door clicking into its rightful hinge. I leaned back in my chair, letting the steam from my tea warm my face. It felt good to have even one person confirm what I kept doubting. I held the phone for another moment before setting it down gently on the table. Just as I stood to stretch, the doorbell rang once, short, sharp, and then silence. I froze, listening. It wasn't late, but the unexpectedness of it prickled along my spine. I stepped toward the peephole cautiously, but whoever had been there was already gone. The hallway outside was empty, still, humming with the usual quiet of the building. I stayed there for a moment, hand on the knob, heartbeat steadying. Strange how even silence could feel like an omen. I locked the door again and walked back inside, feeling the small weight of the phone in my pocket, like a reminder of a truth I could no longer ignore. I drove to my father's house late Saturday morning, telling myself this visit would be different, that I would stay calm, keep the conversation focused, and bring up the interview without letting the tension swallow everything whole. The walk from the car to his porch felt longer than usual. My shoes carried a fine dust from the park where I'd taken a quiet stroll earlier, trying to steady my breathing before coming here. When I knocked, he opened the door with a heavy sigh, as though the day had already disappointed him. I stepped inside, clutching the strap of my bag, choosing my words before they even touched my tongue. I want to talk about something important, I began. His eyebrows lifted, but not in curiosity, more like a warning. He barely let me take off my jacket before launching into a greeting so loud it made me blink. His voice came barreling into the room, echoing from the tile, bouncing around the kitchen cabinets. I felt the impulse to shrink, the familiar reflex I learned over years, but I held still. My heartbeat quickened, not from fear but from recognition. I'd heard him loud my whole life, but today it struck differently, almost metallic. He gestured toward the table with an impatient flick, as if the whole world moved too slowly for him. I stepped closer, swallowing the knot rising in my throat. Can we talk calmly today? I asked, hoping softness might land somewhere. It didn't. My voice trembled slightly as I tried again. I just want to discuss the interview. But he cut me off with another booming retort. Why do you keep bringing that up? You're not thinking straight. Something in me flared, shaky but insistent. Could you lower your voice, please? I said. My words were steady, gentle, almost fragile, but they held. He stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. The quiet request, simple as it was, seemed to ignite something in him. His jaw tightened, shoulders stiffening like he was preparing for battle. I forced myself not to look away. I wouldn't whisper my needs anymore.
His hand came down on the table hard enough that the sound jumped in the air like a metal strike. This is my house, he barked. The sentence cracked through the kitchen, harsher than anything he'd said that morning. The air seemed to snap with it. The force sent a ripple through me, sharp and cold, but underneath it, beneath the instinctive flinch, came something else. A tiredness that felt old and bone deep. I didn't shout back. I didn't match his force. I simply stepped back, my fingers curling slowly as I steadied myself. I'm not trying to take your house from you, I whispered. I just want to be spoken to like I matter. Out of the corner of my eye, I sensed movement. I turned my head just slightly and saw the neighbor's face in the doorway screen. Just a glimpse, a curious tilt, eyes skimming across the scene before flicking away. Embarrassment washed over me, a prickling heat rising up my neck. Being yelled at privately was one thing. Being witnessed, exposed, felt like something more painful, something sharp. I breathed through it, grounding myself with the feel of the floor beneath my shoes. I didn't rush to hide anything. I didn't smooth over the moment. I just stood there, letting the truth hang in the air, visible enough that even a stranger could see it. A glass of water on the table sat close to the edge, still half full. With the force of his last outburst, it had tilted slightly, the waterline shifting dangerously high along one side. As I looked at it, the surface wavered, trembling with the fading echo of his voice. For a moment, it seemed like even the glass wanted to spill, like the room itself couldn't contain the weight of the moment. I stepped back, breathing carefully, my body choosing distance before my mind fully caught up. Something inside me tightened, then loosened, as if a decision was forming, quietly, silently, without my permission. I didn't plan to say anything bold. I didn't walk into his house intending to draw a line. But the moment stretched taut between us, his voice still reverberating off the walls, my heart beating a little too close to my throat. I took a slow breath and let it settle before I spoke. I'm going to leave if this continues. My tone was even, not dramatic, not trembling, just steady. The words surprised even me. They floated there in the charged air, soft but irreversible. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I existed in the room as more than a shape he spoke at. I waited for his reaction, feeling the weight of the decision settle into my spine. He scoffed, a low, dismissive sound that curled into something sharper. "Oh, come on," he said, waving his hand as if brushing off a joke. You always make everything bigger than it is.
The dismissal was familiar, but it landed differently this time, heavier, more hollow. A slow-burning ache spread through my chest. He truly believed this was nothing, that I was nothing. His lips twitched into a half-smirk, one I'd seen countless times, the one that had shut me down since childhood. I let the silence stretch, refusing to shrink into it. My fingers tingled with adrenaline, but my face held still. I turned toward the door, each step feeling both fragile and firm. The cool air from the hallway brushed against my arm, raising goosebumps. Behind me, his voice followed, sharp, irritated, carrying a tone that said, "You'll come back like always." I reached for the handle, pausing long enough to gather one final breath. My chest tightened, but not from fear this time, more like release. I opened the door and the outside air rushed in, crisp and grounding. For a heartbeat, I felt suspended between two worlds, the familiar hurt behind me and the quiet uncertainty ahead. I chose the uncertainty. Once outside, the wind swept across my face, cool and steady, as if the world itself exhaled with me. I didn't look back. My footsteps were small but decisive as I walked toward the driveway. There was a tremor in my hands, but it felt more like momentum than doubt. For the first time in years, my movement wasn't dictated by his voice. It belonged to me. When I reached my car, I leaned against the door for a moment, letting my heart beat slow. The ache in my chest softened into something gentler, something close to pride, though I wasn't ready to name it yet. I pulled out my phone and typed a single message to Marcy. I left. A moment later, her reply lit up the screen. "Good. You chose yourself." I stared at those words, letting them settle deep. My throat tightened with something that wasn't sadness, more like recognition. I slipped into the driver's seat and turned the key, the hum of the engine filling the silence in a way that didn't overwhelm me, didn't demand anything from me. I sat there with the seatbelt unbuckled, hands on the steering wheel, breathing in the moment like it was new air. As I started to pull away, I heard the faint slam of the screen door behind me, a quick, sharp sound carried by the wind. It vibrated through the quiet street before dissolving into stillness. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. The noise faded behind me the same way his house did in the rearview mirror, receding into distance, no longer the center of my world. Driving away felt strange and steady, like learning the first steps of a language I'd never believed I could speak. That night, back in my apartment, I pulled the curtains closed and sat on the floor beside my coffee table with my laptop open. The room was dim, lit only by the soft yellow lamp near the bookshelf. I opened the folder where I'd saved the recordings, my hands hovering for a moment before clicking on the first clip. As the screen brightened, a strange steadiness filled me. This was the quiet I had chosen. My space, my rules, my pace. I tucked my legs beneath me and let the familiar hum of the room settle into a backdrop of calm. One by one, the thumbnails lit up, each one holding a piece of something I wasn't ready to look at, but needed to. I exhaled slowly, preparing myself for whatever truth the playback would confirm. The ceiling fan above me spun faster than usual, its steady whir tugging at the corners of the silence. It had always been there, a quiet murmur I barely noticed, but tonight the sound seemed louder, almost insistent, as if the room itself was urging me to listen differently, more intentionally. I clicked play on the first recording, and the spike of my father's voice burst through the speakers, sharp enough to pull my shoulders up. The ceiling fan's hum layered beneath it, a steady undercurrent. For a moment, I felt both sounds, the familiar drone and the jarring shout, merging into something I'd spent years trying not to acknowledge. I paused the clip, letting the overlapping noises fade into the stillness again.
I pressed play once more, this time listening not just to the volume, but to the memory behind it. The moment he snapped, "Do you hear me?" echoed through the room, and the version of me on the screen seemed to flinch even before I did. My breath caught as I watched the sound waves jump violently with each syllable. How many times had I heard this tone? How many times had I blamed myself for reacting to it? I leaned closer to the screen, studying the way my own voice went quiet, barely a thread between his peaks. It was the first time I could observe the dynamic without being swallowed by it. The distance was clearer and painful. I opened another clip, the one from a few days earlier, when he told me I was being too sensitive. Hearing it play back felt like reliving the moment in slow motion, only this time, I wasn't inside it. I watched my reflection in the screen, the faint glow highlighting the tightness around my eyes. There was a clarity that hadn't been there before. The realization that his loudness wasn't simply habit, it was a pattern. A presence that pushed and pushed until I disappeared into the smallest version of myself. But the woman sitting here now, listening, wasn't disappearing. She was studying, understanding, naming. My fingertips rested on the keyboard, steady despite the storm of feelings rising in my chest. The fan above me picked up speed, its sound shifting, tugging gently at the quiet, like something tapping to get my attention. I tilted my head up toward it, then back to the screen. I wasn't afraid of the noise this time. I simply noticed it, accepted it. I let my gaze soften, listening to both the fan and the clips with a new kind of awareness. The hum was no longer a backdrop I faded behind. It was just a sound, no louder than my own breath. I let that realization settle into my body, slow and sure, as if reclaiming a small but essential corner of myself. I scrubbed through the last recording, watching the audio levels spike into red at the highest moments. The final burst of his voice clipped the microphone, distorting into a harsh static that made me wince. The sound wasn't just loud, it was overwhelming. Overwhelming enough that even the device couldn't hold it. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the lid click shut in a soft, decisive motion. The room fell quiet again, the fan's hum settling into a gentler rhythm. I drew my knees to my chest, breathing in the calm. It wasn't strength yet, not quite, but it was awakening, and it was mine. Sunday morning crept in with a pale light slipping through my blinds. I sat at my desk, the one crammed into the corner of my apartment, and opened a new folder on my laptop. My fingers hovered over the trackpad for a moment, before dragging the 5 clearest recordings into it, each one a small knot in my chest. Selecting them felt strangely ceremonial, like gathering evidence not for someone else, but for myself. The clips sat side by side in the folder, little digital fragments of years I'd tried to explain away. My hands trembled slightly as I organized them by date, lining up each moment of his voice rising, each moment mine disappeared. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for clarity, something I'd never had before. Next, I opened a blank document and typed 3 short lines. Simple guidelines, nothing elaborate. No yelling, no cutting each other off. Take a pause if voices rise. The rules look so basic they could have been written for 2 strangers learning to speak politely. But that was the point, wasn't it? To reset things at the most fundamental level. I printed the page and lifted it from the warm tray, the smell of fresh ink surprising me with its comfort. Holding that single sheet of paper made my heart beat slow. It felt like a boundary I could touch, a line I could actually see. Something firm in a life where everything had been so fluid around his mood. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the paper tucked into the corner of the frame, and read each line out loud. My reflection looked back at me with cautious determination. No yelling, I said softly, practicing the firmness without harshness. No cutting each other off. My voice steadied with each repetition, smoothing into something that didn't tremble. Take a pause if voices rise. It felt strange, rehearsing boundaries the way someone rehearses a speech,
but necessary. I watching my shoulders square, my breath deepen, as if my body was finally aligning with a truth my mind had been circling for years. By noon, I'd made up my mind. I texted my father and asked if we could meet outside, in the backyard. "I want to talk in an open space," I wrote. I didn't offer explanations or soften the edges with promises the way I used to. I kept the message short. When he responded with a simple, "Fine," something inside me loosened. A tiny thread of control woven back into my hands. I grabbed my bag, slipping the printed guidelines and my laptop inside. Walking down the stairs of my building, I felt the cool railing under my fingers, the steady rhythm of my steps grounding me with each floor I descended. Before leaving, I sent a quick text to Marcy. "Heading to talk to him. Wish me luck." 3 dots appeared almost instantly, followed by her reply. "You've got this. I'm here if you need me." That small burst of encouragement warmed me more than the sun outside. I paused at the curb, the breeze brushing my hair back, carrying a faint scent of someone's laundry detergent through the air. I inhaled deeply, letting the moment stretch. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a step towards something resembling self-protection, maybe even self-respect. When I reached his house, the wind chimes on his back patio clinked against each other, soft, uneven notes carried by the shifting air. I stood still for a moment, listening, letting the sound calm the jitter in my stomach. Once the subtle music faded into a gentle hum, I walked to the backyard, my bag slung across my shoulder, each step deliberate. I didn't know how the conversation would unfold. I didn't know if he would listen or erupt. But for the first time, I wasn't arriving empty-handed. I was arriving prepared. And that in itself felt like its own quiet victory. I set the laptop on the patio table, its silver surface catching a slice of afternoon light. My father sat across from me with his arms crossed, the posture of someone already bracing for an argument. I didn't sit right away. I took a breath, steadying myself, then slid into the chair opposite him. "I want you to listen to something," I said quietly. He let out a huff, a sound loaded with skepticism. I ignored it. My fingers moved with surprising calm as I clicked open the first video. The screen brightened, reflecting faintly in the glass door behind us. For a heartbeat, he looked bored, as if expecting some mundane clip. But I pressed play, and the familiar recording burst into the air, his voice sharp and impossible to soften. His eyes twitched, almost flinched, though he quickly tried to cover it with stillness. The sound poured out like static, and command rolled into one. "Do you hear me?" His recorded self barked through the small speakers, louder than the breeze, louder than everything. The patio felt smaller instantly, squeezed by the echo he couldn't deny. I watched him more than the screen. His jaw tightened, a muscle near his temple pulsing. It was the first time he'd ever truly heard himself, without the adrenaline of the moment, without the justifications, without me shrinking in front of him. The recording continued, each spike flattening the quiet space between us. He opened his mouth once, as if to interrupt, but then closed it again. Even he couldn't talk over himself. He stared at the screen with a stiffness I'd never seen before. The color drained slightly from his cheeks. There was confusion, then recognition, brief, sharp, before anger swept in to hide it. "What is this supposed to be?" he snapped, though the edge of uncertainty threaded through his tone. I didn't look away. "It's you," I said softly. "Just you." His eyes narrowed, but the video cut through anything he tried to build. Each loud word from the recording collided against the present moment, like evidence laid out in plain sight. The truth didn't need my commentary. It was already pouring out, undeniable. His anger rose as if on command. "You're trying to embarrass me," he said, his voice starting to lift again, but not as freely as before. This time he hesitated, as though hearing the parallel between his present tone and the one shouting through the speakers. That split second mattered. It landed like a crack in old concrete.
"You're twisting things," he insisted, but his eyes flicked back to the screen, betraying something he couldn't quite conceal. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, not arguing, not defending, just letting the moment stand. And that restraint unsettled him more than anything. The video kept playing, his voice layering over his own anger in real time. I watched the conflict in his face, the flicker of shock, the recoil, the attempt to regain control. "Just listen," I said, my voice low and steady, almost whisper-soft. "Please, just hear it." My throat felt tight, but I didn't let it break. He tried to look away, but the sound made that impossible. It filled the backyard, spilled past the table, tangled in the wind. Hearing it outside of his own head left him nowhere to hide. He swallowed hard, and for a moment his chest froze mid-breath. The clip ended abruptly, the sound cutting off like a slammed door. The sudden silence felt heavier than the recording itself. Even the wind paused. My father's gaze stayed fixed on the darkened screen, his expression unreadable. Shock, denial, humiliation all pressing in at once. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The air around us vibrated faintly with the echo of what he had just heard, a truth too loud to ignore. For the first time, it wasn't my reaction that filled the space. It was his. My father shot up so fast the patio chair scraped violently against the concrete. He leaned over the table and reached for the laptop, fingers stiff with outrage, as if shutting the screen would undo what he'd just heard. I held the edge of the device with one hand. Not forceful, not confrontational, just firmly enough to keep it open. "Don't," I said softly. The simplicity of the word seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. His eyes darted from my hand to my face, stunned that I didn't recoil the way I always had. His breathing quickened, chest rising and falling with sharp indignation. For a moment, everything on the patio felt tilted, like a scene moments before a storm breaks. He straightened, anger flushing through him in a hot wave. "I am your father," he thundered, the declaration bursting out of him like something he believed should end the conversation. The words felt familiar, but not grounding, not protective. They felt like an old shield he was trying to wield out of habit. "You don't get to accuse me," he continued, voice swelling, raw and rattling. The air vibrated with the force of it. I felt the sound hit me, the way it always had, except this time, something inside me held steady. I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize. I didn't fold myself into the smaller shape he preferred. When I finally spoke, my voice was so quiet it almost felt like it belonged to someone else. "But I'm a person," I said. Not a counterattack, not a negotiation, just truth, pure and unadorned. The moment the words left me, something inside shifted, like a lock turning. His face tightened with confusion, real confusion, as if the idea had never been presented to him in such simple terms. For a second, the anger in his eyes flickered, unsettled by the fact that I wasn't arguing back at his volume. I wasn't battling him. I was just standing there, with a dignity he didn't know how to confront. The air between us thickened. The wind that had been brushing through the yard seemed to pull back, leaving a stillness that made everything sharper. The sound of my breathing, the quiver in his hands, the way he couldn't decide whether to shout again or retreat. For once, he didn't fill the silence with noise. He seemed unsure how. His mouth opened, then closed. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, an uncertainty that looked almost like fear, or maybe recognition, or maybe both. He took a half step back, the ground no longer as steady beneath him as it had always been. His heel clipped the leg of the patio chair behind him. The stumble broke through the tension like a sudden crack. He reached for the back of the chair, fingers gripping the metal frame, but the chair tipped instead. It clattered onto the concrete in a harsh, jarring thud. My father froze. The sound echoed through the yard, sharp enough to snap both of us into stillness. For a moment, his face broke open, anger dissolving into something raw, something unguarded. Embarrassment, maybe,
or the realization that he was no longer the one controlling the moment. He blinked hard, as if fighting something behind his eyes. The chair lay on its side between us, its metal legs pointing skyward, like a question neither of us knew how to answer. He stepped back again, chest rising and falling in uneven beats. I stayed where I was, hands still resting gently on the laptop, grounding myself in the calm I'd fought so long to find. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was a breaking point, a widening crack neither of us could pretend wasn't there. I looked at him, not in defiance, not in fear, but in a quiet steadiness that finally belonged to me. And he looked away first. The morning after our confrontation, I walked into the county clerk's building with a form folded neatly in my bag. The lobby smelled faintly of paper and old carpet, a strange but oddly comforting neutrality. When I reached the window, the woman behind the glass greeted me in a soft voice, gentle, unhurried, the kind that didn't compete with the world. I handed her the change of address form, my fingers brushing the cool surface of the counter. "Moving?" she asked lightly. "Something like that," I replied. She stamped the paperwork with a dull thud, the sound oddly grounding. For the first time in a long while, nobody's voice outweighed mine. The simple civility of the interaction settled over me like a balm I didn't know I needed. Walking out into the crisp air, I felt something inside me unclench. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, more like a loosening of a knot I'd been gripping for years. I stopped at a small cafe on the corner and bought a hot chocolate instead of my usual black coffee. The warmth spread through my hands, caramel sweet steam rising into the cool morning. I closed my eyes and let the simplicity of it sink in. No raised voice, no edge of tension waiting to snap, just quiet, just breath. I watched a couple across the street laugh softly at something only they could hear. The normalcy of it made my chest ache with a mix of longing and relief. On the bench outside the cafe, I pulled out my phone twice before putting it back into my pocket. I felt the urge to text him, to explain, to smooth things over the way I always had. The instinct was old, deeply ingrained like muscle memory. But when I started typing, the words tasted like apology before I'd even finished the first sentence. I deleted them. Tried again. Deleted them again. My throat tightened, not with fear, but with the realization of how much of my life had been lived in response to him. I leaned back, letting the cool wooden slats press against my spine, grounding me in the present. After several minutes of circling the same thought, I finally typed a new message. Short, careful, honest. To avoid hurting each other, I need some time and space. I read it twice, making sure it didn't blame him, didn't provoke him, didn't hide what I felt. It simply stated a boundary, a clean line. My thumb hovered for a moment before I hit send. The message left my phone in a small whoosh of air, hardly dramatic enough for the weight behind it. I exhaled slowly, the finality of it settling in my bones. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't expect one. When I stood to leave, the breeze caught the edge of the extra copy of my form sticking out of my bag. The paper fluttered free, drifting down the sidewalk and catching on a patch of grass before I scooped it up. It felt symbolic, that brief moment of almost losing something already changed. I folded the form tightly and tucked it deeper into my bag, securing it with a decisiveness I wasn't used to. The city hummed around me, cars passing, distant chatter, the soft rumble of a bus approaching. All of it felt gentler than the voices I'd grown up with. All of it felt like room. As I headed home, the weight on my shoulders didn't vanish, but it shifted, less crushing, more manageable. Every step felt deliberate, almost like walking toward a version of myself I hadn't met yet. I didn't know what the next week would bring, or how my father would react to the message. But for now the silence was mine, earned and chosen, and I let it stretch out ahead of me, a path not free of pain, but free of the noise that had always drowned it out. That night my apartment felt unusually calm, as if the walls themselves recognized the space I'd carved out earlier that day. I lay in bed with the window cracked open, letting the cool air drift in. Sometime past midnight, a soft change in the air stirred me awake. At first I thought it was just the breeze brushing the curtains, but then I heard it, the faint shift of the ceiling fan above me. It wasn't loud or intrusive, just a small, gentle whir adjusting its rhythm. I stared up at the slow rotation, noticing how unthreatening it felt in the dark. This fan, which once seemed like an echo of something bigger and heavier, was now simply a quiet reminder that I was in my own space, a place where nothing had to be louder than me. I sat up slightly, pulling the blanket around my shoulders. The silence in the room was soft, almost tender, and it struck me how different it felt from the silence I used to endure at my father's house. The brittle, waiting kind, always on the edge of being broken by a voice that filled every corner. Here the quiet wasn't tense, it was healing. I rested my palm on my chest and felt my breath settle into a steady pattern. I didn't feel afraid of the night or the echoes of past conversations. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar. Relief. A small, growing comfort that wrapped itself around me just as gently as the blanket. I reached for my journal on the nightstand, flipping to a blank page. The bedside lamp cast a soft circle of light that didn't intrude on the calm. I wrote slowly, the pen gliding across the paper. I don't want to live in noise anymore. Seeing the sentence written out made my throat tighten, not from sadness, but from recognition. The truth of it pressed warm against my ribs. I didn't need paragraphs or explanations. That single line carried everything, the years of flinching, shrinking, apologizing for reacting to hurt I didn't deserve. I closed the journal and let my hand rest on it, grounding myself in the honesty that had finally made it onto the page. My gaze drifted across the room to the small potted plant sitting on the windowsill, the one I'd nearly forgotten to water last week. Its leaves caught a sliver of moonlight, glossy and stubbornly alive. I walked over and touched one leaf gently. "You're still hanging on," I murmured, a tired smile tugging at my lips. It felt symbolic in a way I didn't want to overthink. That tiny plant had survived in low light with irregular care and still managed to stretch toward whatever brightness it could find. Maybe I was doing the same without realizing it. The thought warmed me from the inside, softening something that had been tense for too long. The fan clipped softly again, a single, subtle sound that barely disturbed the night. I exhaled. It felt less like an interruption and more like a reminder that not every noise carried danger. I settled back into bed, tucking the blanket beneath my chin. Outside, a car passed quietly on the street. A dog barked once in the distance. Normal sounds. Harmless sounds. I let them fill the space where dread used to live. I don't have to go back to that, I whispered into the dark, letting the truth wash over me slowly. I didn't need permission to choose peace. My phone buzzed just as I was drifting toward sleep. I reached for it reluctantly, already knowing who it would be. His message glowed on the screen. "When you're more mature, you'll understand." No greeting, no softness, just the same old script. I stared at the words, feeling the sting of them, but it didn't pierce the way it once did. Instead, the message sat on the surface of me, unable to sink in. I locked the phone and placed it face down on the nightstand, refusing to let it pull me out of the calm I'd earned. The quiet wrapped around me again as I lay back down. For the first time in years, I didn't fall asleep bracing for anything. A few days later, I met Marcy at the small park near the library where we both worked. The late afternoon sun filtered through the thin canopy of trees, casting dappled patches of gold across the path. We walked slowly, our steps falling into an easy rhythm. I told her bits and pieces of the confrontation, How he reacted, how I felt, how the silence afterward wasn't frightening for once. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't know how. I just laid out the facts the way someone unpacks a box they've carried too long. Marcy listened with a seriousness that steadied me. The faint rustle of leaves under our shoes softened the heaviness of the conversation, making it easier to breathe in between sentences. At one point, she stopped mid-step, turning to face me. "You know loud doesn't mean right, right?" she said. Her voice wasn't sharp, just firm enough to land. I blinked at her, caught off guard by the simplicity of her statement. "He's always been that way," I said, a reflexive line I'd used too many times. She shook her head. "That doesn't make it normal." The words hung in the air, warmer than the sunlight, but heavier somehow. I let them sink in, feeling a strange mixture of resistance and acceptance. No one had ever said it so plainly before. No one had held the truth up without cushioning it. We continued walking. The breeze brushed past us, carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut grass. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, a clear, uncomplicated sound that made something in my chest loosen. "I think I forgot what calm feels like," I admitted. My voice sounded small, but not ashamed. Marcy looked at me with the kind of empathy that didn't pity, didn't crowd, just witnessed. "It's not your fault," she said. "People learn to adapt to storms when they think it's weather they're born into." The metaphor landed harder than I expected. I nodded slowly, feeling the edges of my old defenses crumble just a little. I stopped walking, needing stillness to absorb the moment. The sunlight hit my face in a soft, angled beam, warm enough to chase away the tension from my shoulders. For the first time in days, I felt the ache behind my ribs shift into something lighter. Tears pricked unexpectedly, quick and embarrassed, but Marcy didn't react with surprise. She just stood beside me, quiet and steady. I wiped my cheek with the back of my hand. "I'm so tired of the noise," I said. It wasn't a confession. It was a release. She nodded softly, as if she'd been waiting for me to finally say it. "I want to live gently," I whispered into the breeze. Saying it out loud made the desire feel real, not just a private wish scribbled in a journal. Marcy smiled, a small, supportive curve of the lips. "Then start choosing gentle," she said, "even if it's one tiny step at a time." Her voice blended with the rustling trees, quiet and natural. I inhaled deeply, letting the afternoon air settle into my lungs. The heaviness didn't vanish, but it shifted, becoming a weight I could carry without collapsing beneath it. With each breath, I felt myself anchoring into a truth I'd avoided. I didn't have to live inside someone else's storm. I could walk my own path out of it. As we turned back toward the park entrance, the sunlight filtered through in long, slanted beams, illuminating the path ahead. I didn't feel fully healed, and I wouldn't pretend otherwise. But there was a clarity now, a soft, steady awareness that I deserved peace. Not as a reward, but as a right. The leaves rustled overhead, a gentle applause from the world around us. I tucked my hands into my jacket pockets, feeling the warmth from earlier still lingering. "Thank you," I said quietly. Marcy bumped her shoulder against mine. "You're getting stronger," she murmured, and for once, I believed her. The next morning I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the cursor blinking on a fresh document. I took a slow breath and typed out the 3 communication rules again, but this time I refined them, clearer, firmer, shaped by everything I'd learned in the past week. No yelling, no interrupting. Pause for 2 minutes if voices rise. I read the lines out loud, letting the words settle into the air. They weren't demands. They weren't ultimatums. They were boundaries, simple, humane, and long overdue. I adjusted the spacing, bolded the text, and saved the file as a PDF. Seeing the rules in that neat official format felt strangely empowering, like reclaiming a piece of myself one sentence at a time.
I printed the page and taped it gently to the edge of my desk, stepping back to look at it. It wasn't decorative or poetic, just clean and honest. The sight of it made something settle in me, as if naming the lines made them real. I practiced saying them aloud again, not for him, but for me. "No yelling," I murmured, finding steadiness in the repetition. "No interrupting." My voice grew firmer, not louder. "Take a pause." I watched my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop, noticing the way my posture shifted, a small but important correction. For once, I wasn't shrinking to fit the space around someone else. I was shaping the space myself. With my heart thudding lightly in my chest, I opened a new message and attached the PDF. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing. "These are the guidelines I need if we're going to talk without hurting each other. Please read them." I didn't embellish. I didn't apologize. The simplicity of the message felt like a milestone. My hand tingled as I reached for the send button, aware of the significance resting in that tiny square.
I clicked it. The message whooshed out of my phone with a soft digital flutter, leaving a faint echo of adrenaline behind. I set the phone down gently, feeling both exposed and steady. To distract myself, I grabbed the printed rules and took them to the mirror. I stood there for several minutes, reading them out loud the same way someone might rehearse a poem or a speech, slowly, intentionally, letting each phrase fill the space between me and my reflection. With every repetition, my voice grew more grounded. I could feel the tremors in my spine easing, replaced by a calm I wasn't used to. The mirror showed a woman I recognized, but was only beginning to understand. Someone who had endured too much noise for too long, someone now learning the shape of her own voice. My phone buzzed then, making me jump slightly. A single checkmark turned blue beside the message I'd sent. He'd read it. For a moment, my breath caught, but there was no immediate reply. Not anger, not dismissal, not the familiar flood of defense. Just silence. I stared at the screen, unsure what to make of the gap between the message and the response that didn't come. The space felt new. Not empty, but open. Unexpectedly, a small laugh escaped my lips. A soft, relieved exhale I hadn't planned. I took a seat on the couch, letting the quiet settle around me without fear. A moment later, my screen lit again. This time it wasn't from him, it was from Marcy. A simple sticker of a heart. No lecture, no probing questions, just support. I smiled, the tension in my shoulders softening as I typed back a quick thank you. When I set the phone aside, I noticed the printed rules on the table beside me, the corners uncurled, the ink crisp. They looked like a promise I'd finally made to myself. I reached out and touched the page lightly, feeling the texture of the paper beneath my fingertips. For the first time, it felt like I was building something, not out of fear, but out of clarity, out of choice. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a video call request from my father. The screen lit up with his name, and for a moment, I just stared at it, steadying my breath. I considered letting it ring out, letting silence be its own message, but something inside nudged me forward. I accepted the call. His face appeared, framed by the familiar kitchen behind him. "Hi," he said, and the word came out quieter than I expected. Not soft, not gentle, but lower, contained. It was strange enough that I blinked. "Hi," I echoed, sitting upright. The stillness between us didn't feel hostile. It felt tentative. He cleared his throat, looking off to the side like he was searching for a script. The effort showed, and though it didn't erase the past, it shifted something in the present. The conversation began awkwardly. He asked about work, about the library, about whether I was eating well. Questions he usually asked with a bluntness that felt more like checking boxes than caring. But today, he paused between each one, as if measuring the distance of his own volume. Twice, his voice climbed, almost out of habit, like a reflex he wasn't fully aware of. "Well, I just think you," he started, louder, the old tone creeping up. My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice steady. "You're getting louder," I said gently, not scolding, not accusing, just naming the shift. His face tightened, but he stopped. Actually stopped. A small silence settled between us, fragile as glass. He exhaled, this time quieter. That 2-second pause felt monumental. Not because it fixed everything, but because it broke a pattern. My shoulders softened just a little, the tightness in my chest easing as I watched him regroup. His expression wavered between irritation and concentration, as if he was trying to hold on to something slippery. Still, the fact that he tried mattered. We talked about small things after that: my mint tea habit, the plant on my windowsill, the new books at the library. He listened in a way he hadn't in years. Not perfectly, not patiently, but with a kind of halting effort I'd stopped believing he was capable of. At one point, his voice rose again, sharper this time, a stumble rather than an attack, when mentioning something about the neighbor parking too close to his driveway. I felt the old instinct rushing up my spine, the familiar urge to shrink, but I caught it. "You're raising your voice," I said softly. His mouth opened, ready with a retort, but then he stopped himself. A visible struggle flickered behind his eyes before he finally nodded. "All right," he muttered, forcing his tone down. Not perfect, not graceful, but honest. The adjustment startled me with its sincerity. It felt like watching someone relearn how to hold something fragile without crushing it. When the call neared its natural end, neither of us rushed to hang up. That alone felt new. He exhaled through his nose, the sound barely audible. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll try." The admission wasn't grand or poetic. It was awkward, stiff, uncertain, but real. I felt a warmth bloom in my chest that wasn't naive hope, but something quieter, something cautious. "Thank you," I said. And I meant it, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement, as a first step in a landscape neither of us had ever walked before. We said goodbye, both hesitant, unsure of how to close a conversation that hadn't erupted or collapsed. After the call ended, the screen dimmed slowly, revealing my reflection in the black glass, tired but lighter. The webcam clicked softly as it adjusted to the absence of motion, its small lens reflecting a glint of afternoon light. The apartment settled back into silence, gentle and breathable. I leaned back on the couch, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. This wasn't repair. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way I once hoped. But it was movement. Slow, imperfect, human movement. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet that followed didn't feel like retreat. It felt like possibility. A week later, I drove to my father's house with a folded grocery bag in the passenger seat. Just a few things he'd asked for. I didn't go inside right away. I stood on the front step, feeling the late afternoon air drift across my face. The house looked the same as ever, but something in me didn't. I rang the bell, waited, and when he opened the door, I stayed on the porch instead of stepping in automatically like I used to. "I brought the things you wanted," I said. He nodded, stepping back slightly, a gesture that could have been an invitation or simply habit. I didn't move. The space between us wasn't strained, just intentional. I held the bag a little tighter, letting the moment stretch instead of rushing to fill it. He started talking before I handed him the bag, filling the air with small complaints about the store being out of his favorite cereal, about the neighbor's dog barking too early in the morning, minor irritations delivered with his usual blunt force. Then his tone shifted as he mentioned the argument we'd had weeks ago, brushing against the subject like someone testing an old bruise. "You know," he said sharply, "you didn't have to leave like that." The edge in his voice rose,
climbing a step too high, too fast. I felt my pulse jump, old instincts rushing to the surface. But I didn't look away. I didn't step back. I simply inhaled, slow and steady, before speaking. "Your voice is getting louder." The words came out clear, measured, not afraid. He froze for a moment. A flicker of something, frustration, maybe embarrassment, passed across his face. For a heartbeat, it seemed like he might pull back, might try to steady himself the way he had during the video call. But the old pattern tugged at him harder. His voice rose again, sharper this time, as he launched into a defensive explanation that spilled out too loudly, too quickly. The pressure in my chest tightened. I felt the familiar heat climbing my neck, that suffocating sense of being swallowed whole. But then, an unexpected calm settled over me, a clarity I hadn't known I possessed. I didn't fight his volume. I didn't match it. I just stepped backward, one deliberate step. "I won't stay if you shout," I said, my voice low but firm. He stopped mid-sentence, the words cutting off like a cord snapped in two. The sudden silence fell heavy between us. His jaw worked as if he were trying to bite back the next wave of anger, but the momentum had already cracked. "I'm not," he started, then caught himself. A confused frown settled in. The shift was small, but I saw it. He didn't know how to react to the boundary without the usual argument to push against. A part of him faltered, not in defeat, but in disorientation. And in that moment, for the first time, I realized that his volume wasn't just control. It was habit. A habit he didn't yet know how to break. I lowered the bag of groceries to the small patio table near the door. "I'm going now," I said softly. Not as punishment, not as threat, just a statement of truth. His eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected me to follow through. "Wait," he said, reaching for a calmer tone but stumbling somewhere between apology and stubbornness. The effort showed, but the shift came too late. I shook my head gently. "Not today." And with that, I turned. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel cruel. It felt necessary. My feet moved with unexpected confidence down the walkway, each step loosening something tight inside my chest. Behind me, the screen door slammed shut, hard and abrupt, the sound cutting through the quiet street. But the noise didn't pierce me the way it once did. It hit the air and dissolved before it reached my spine. I didn't stop. I didn't flinch. I simply kept walking, my keys warm in my hand, my breath steady. The world around me felt open in a way it never had outside his house. As I reached my car, I realized something weighty and freeing at once. I wasn't walking away from him. I was walking toward myself. And that felt like the truest step I'd ever taken. 2 days later, I sat at the small table near my apartment window, with the official change of address form laid flat in front of me. The midday light washed over it, turning the paper almost translucent around the edges. I held the pen a moment longer than necessary, letting the weight of the decision settle. Not heavy, but intentional. When I finally signed my name, the ink glided across the page in a smooth, certain line. It didn't feel like severing anything. It felt like choosing a new center to stand on, one that wasn't constantly shifting under someone else's storm. I lifted the paper, reading my signature one more time, then set it gently into the envelope beside my laptop. The clerk at the post office barely looked up as he stamped the envelope and placed it in a bin behind the counter. But the sound of the stamp hitting paper echoed in me like a quiet affirmation. When I stepped back outside, the sun seemed brighter, the air less dense. I tucked the receipt into my pocket and walked down the sidewalk with a small, subtle lift in my steps. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't escape. It was steadiness, the kind I'd always thought belonged to other people. For the first time, my address wasn't an extension of his house or his expectations. It was mine. And the freedom of that truth settled warm in my ribs. That afternoon, back in my apartment,
I folded a copy of the form into the outer pocket of my bag. Not to show anyone, not even him. Just to remind myself that I had made a choice grounded in self-preservation instead of fear. With the sun dipping toward evening, I sent him a short text. When you're ready to communicate calmly, I'm here. But I won't engage in yelling. No apology, no negotiation. Just clarity. I stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send. A small tremor moved through my hand. Not of hesitation, but of release. There was no response. The screen stayed quietly lit, then dimmed. I didn't chase it. The apartment felt peaceful as I moved through it. Soft light on the floor, a faint scent of mint rising from the mug by my sink. I put water on the stove, watching the kettle warm slowly. The simplicity of the moment felt like something I had earned. When the water finally steamed, I dropped a mint tea bag into my favorite chipped ceramic cup and poured carefully. The scent unfurled in the air, fresh and green, filling the quiet corners of the room. I wrapped my hands around the cup, breathing in the warmth. It was such a small ritual, but it pressed calm into places that had been loud for far too long. I sat at the kitchen counter, sipping slowly as the light changed from gold to evening blue. My phone buzzed once, a delivery notification, not him. The absence of his voice didn't feel like avoidance, it felt like space. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill the room naturally. Not heavy, not waiting to be broken, just silence. My mind wandered to the copy of the signed form tucked safely in my bag. That thin sheet of paper wasn't a wall between us. It was a boundary meant to protect both sides from the harm we kept recreating. It marked a shift not in love, but in how I allowed myself to exist within that love. Later, as the night lamps flickered on around the neighborhood, I placed the signed form inside a small folder by my bookshelf. The ink had dried fully, the letters deep and steady under the lamp's glow. I traced the line of my name with the tip of my finger, not sad, not angry, just certain. I closed the folder and set it upright, feeling the stillness of the apartment settle around me like a second skin. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a direction, and I was following it, one careful, necessary step at a time. Several weeks passed before my phone lit up with his name again. I was slicing apples in my kitchen when the ringtone cut through the soft hum of the apartment. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, the knife paused midair. Something inside me steadied before I reached for the phone. "Hi, Dad," I said when I answered, keeping my voice level. The line was quiet for a few seconds, long enough for me to hear his breath, low and even. "I've been thinking," he finally said, and the tone was unfamiliar, lower, subdued, stripped of its usual armor. I leaned against the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath my palm. His voice didn't tremble with volume, it trembled with effort. He cleared his throat, a soft sound, almost uneasy. "I watched the videos again," he said. The admission dropped into the space between us with a heaviness I wasn't prepared for. My fingers tightened around the phone. "Yeah?" I replied, barely above a whisper. He inhaled slowly, and when he spoke again the words were careful, like stepping across uneven ground. "I didn't know I sounded like that." His voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was stripped raw. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of his sentence settle in the quiet of my kitchen. I could almost hear the shift happening in him, subtle, unpolished, but real. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the refrigerator hum behind me, the faint tick of the clock above the stove. Then he said the words I never thought I'd hear from him. "I sounded scary." The honesty in that single word pressed against something deep in my chest, loosening a knot I had carried for years. I didn't speak. Not yet. I let him hold his own admission without rushing in to soften it, without rescuing him from the discomfort that was finally his to feel. He exhaled shakily, and the sound carried a vulnerability I had never witnessed from him before. "You were right to leave," he added quietly. The sentence shook me, gentle but powerful. It wasn't an apology in the formal sense, but it reached deeper than one. I let the silence answer him first. A silence not of tension, but of recognition. "Thank you for saying that," I murmured eventually, my voice thick with a tenderness I didn't expect. My eyes stung, but I blinked the tears back, not because I wanted to hide them, but because I wanted to stay present. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't crumbling into anger. He was standing in a truth he had avoided for decades. We talked a little longer, not about the past, not about blame, just small things, how the weather had shifted, how the mint plant on my windowsill had sprouted a new leaf, how he'd been taking walks in the evening to clear his head, though he stumbled over the phrasing. The conversation didn't feel rushed or heavy. It felt spacious, like we were inhabiting a quiet room neither of us had been allowed into before. We weren't fixing anything. We weren't erasing anything. We were simply meeting each other without the echo of old patterns, and that felt like a beginning. After we said goodbye, I kept the phone pressed to my ear for a few extra seconds, listening to the fading static before lowering it. The apartment felt gentler somehow, as if the light through the window had softened without moving. The fan above me turned in a slow, even rhythm, steady, unintrusive. I inhaled deeply, letting the quiet swell around me. I hadn't forgiven everything. He hadn't unlearned everything. But something had shifted in both of us, a tentative bridge rising from the stillness. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet between us felt like peace rather than aftermath. A month later, I drove to his house again, not because he asked, but because it felt like the right time. The late afternoon sun slanted across the lawn as I stepped onto the familiar porch. When he opened the door, he didn't try to fill the moment with noise. He simply nodded and stepped aside. I didn't go in right away. I looked at him, really looked, and saw something in his posture I'd never noticed before. Restraint. Not fear, not tension, just an effort to meet the moment gently. I stepped inside, the air carrying a faint hint of coffee and cedar. The house felt quieter, not because it had changed, but because I had. We sat at the kitchen table, 2 mugs between us, his black, mine with a splash of cream. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted his cup. "I've been working on it," he said without preamble. Not boastful, not defensive, just honest. I nodded, letting the words settle. "I noticed on the phone," I said. The acknowledgement softened something in his shoulders. For a long moment we didn't speak. The silence didn't push or smother. It simply existed, steady as the afternoon light pooling across the table. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, wrinkled, creased, clearly handled many times. The communication guidelines I'd sent him. "I read them every morning," he murmured, clearing his throat. "It helps." We talked slowly, step by step, like people learning to match each other's pace. He admitted that he'd felt ashamed after hearing the recordings again. Not humiliated, ashamed. There was a difference, and he seemed to understand that now. "I didn't think of you as scared," he said quietly, eyes fixed on a faint scratch in the tabletop. "I thought you were just reacting." The simplicity of the confession pressed into the softest parts of me. "I was scared," I admitted, my voice barely above breath. He looked up then, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, regret, and something close to mourning for the years lost in the noise between us. He apologized, not in a dramatic declaration, not with rehearsed lines, but in fragments. "I'm sorry I made it hard to talk to me." "I'm sorry I made things louder than they needed to be."
I'm sorry it took this long to hear you.
Each sentence was uneven, raw around the edges, as if he was speaking truths his mouth wasn't used to forming. I let the apologies land without rushing in to dissolve them. They weren't bandages. They were acknowledgments, and they belonged to him. When I finally spoke, it was with a gentle steadiness. Thank you for learning with me. His eyes softened, the harsh lines in his face blurring into something unfamiliar, something almost tender. Before leaving, I stood at the back door where the wind chimes hung. They moved softly in the breeze, their quiet notes drifting through the yard. He stood beside me, not crowding, not towering, just standing. I know I can't change everything overnight, he said, but I want to keep trying, if you'll still talk to me. I turned toward him, feeling a calm confidence settle into my chest. We can talk, just kindly. His nod was small but sincere. We didn't hug, we didn't make promises. We simply shared a moment of steady presence, the kind we'd never managed before. It was enough. As I walked back to my car, the wind brushed through the trees with a soft, steady rhythm. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't sting or suffocate. I reached for my keys, feeling the smooth metal warm against my palm. When I looked back at the house, he was still standing in the doorway, not calling after me, not raising his voice, just watching with a calm I hadn't known he could hold. I got into the car and closed the door gently. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like peace we'd both finally earned, each of us stepping toward it from opposite sides of a long, loud history. In the end, the change didn't arrive with fireworks or grand forgiveness. It came quietly, two people learning slowly to meet each other without fear. My father didn't become a new man overnight, and I didn't suddenly forget the years of noise that shaped me. But we found something softer between us, something worth protecting. A space where voices stayed level, where silence wasn't a threat, and where effort, even imperfect effort, felt like a kind of love. And maybe that's what healing really looks like. Not a clean slate, not a perfect ending, but a steady shift toward gentleness. A pause before raising your voice. A willingness to hear the truth, even when it hurts. A bridge rebuilt, plank by plank, not because the past deserves rewriting, but because the future deserves better. If you've ever had to set boundaries with someone you love, or learn to speak in a voice that finally belongs to you, I'd love to hear your story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences might help someone else find their own quiet strength. And if this journey meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Your support helps these stories continue.